But for now, I'm going to invite Mike on, who is going to read our teaching of Jesus for today, as we look at what it was that Jesus taught that has inspired so many of his followers to do things like welcome strangers into their home.
Thank you very much. So I'm reading from Matthew 5, verses 38 to 40. So you've heard it said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone turn to them the other cheek, so. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them to the one who asks you. To the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. You have heard that it was said, "Love me," but I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? And not even the tax. And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that?
So what we're doing is at the moment just a little mini series that we've called Grace in Action, and it's this whole idea that as Christians we like to talk about the grace of God, and when we looked at Ephesians 1-3, that is one of the things that we looked at was the grace of God, that this idea that He is overflowing in goodness and generosity towards us, and this is a life-changing thing, but it is also something that He invites us into as well. And today we're going to look at how that teaching and that practice of Jesus of grace interacts with all the conflict that is going on in the world. So in the last, that's really good. Sorry, pretend that didn't happen. Right. So in the last couple of weeks, we've had ongoing examples of all the escalating conflict in the world. Probably the one that's freshest in memory and most stark is what happened after the really tragic murder of Sarah Everard. First of all, it became this thing about campaigning for women's safety on the streets. And then there was pushback from some people saying, oh, no, you're stereotyping men and it's very few men and you're being unfair to men and all that kind of thing. And then there was supposed to be vigils, and then there weren't vigils, and there were vigils. And then when there was all this chaos that ensued and people getting arrested. And then just this week, there's a new news story that popped up that's still kind of doing the rounds right now of this guy who is an ex-Marine who stood up to what he would call yobs in his neighborhood who were driving around on quad bikes, wearing balaclavas, causing trouble. And as a result of that, he ended up losing his home as it was set fire to. And what's happening in all of these cases is that attempts to stand up for justice and to make the world a better place are actually backfiring, sometimes quite spectacularly, making the world a worse place. So why is it that our attempts to improve the world do so often backfire spectacularly? And is there a better way of doing conflict that could actually improve the world? Well, that is what we're going to look at today and what Jesus' teaching is all about. So just by way of a reminder of the kind of theory of grace in action. So grace is something that God has done for us. And we looked a lot at that previously, basically how we can have spiritual salvation, we can have life to the fullest, we can be changed as people, we can be forgiven of everything we've done wrong, all because of the actions of God towards us. But what happens then is we undergo a change. We become new people. It's sometimes been known as being born again. And along with that, we also get God, the Holy Spirit, take up residence in our lives. And the combination of us being new people and the power of God working within us means that we can actually start to cooperate with God in the world and in our transformation. In other words, there are things that we can actually do that mean that God's kingdom starts to be seen on earth as in heaven, as Jesus prayed, and that actually we become more and more like God, more and more like Jesus. So previously, those kind of things were out of our reach. But as God gives us a new nature and gives us himself and his empowering, we can actually start to do things for God. And this is what technically is called cooperative grace, or what we are calling grace in action, when that superabundant, crazy, generous love of God is actually something that we live out in the world and not just talk about. And so what Jesus does in the teaching today is give examples of what it looks like when someone has accepted that grace and decided to live it out in the world, what that might look like. So it's important to notice that Jesus, what is doing here is not giving us absolute demands. It's like every time someone literally hits you, you literally have to turn the other cheek and get them to literally hit the other side, and so on and so forth. Although he obviously means that our behavior will be something like that. So he's not just giving a set of rules, but he is giving examples of this is what it looks like when someone has absorbed the teaching of Jesus, understood the grace of God, is empowered by God to go and live that life of grace out on the streets. So let's go through some of those examples. The most famous one, and it's entered English vocabulary, turn the other cheek. So what this is describing is a behavior that is still happens in some parts of the Middle East, which is to slap someone with the back of your hand is not just an act of violence, but more than that, it's a strike to the ego. It's a terrible insult. It says you are the worst kind of person. It's like spitting in someone's face. It is like saying you're the lowest of the low and just treating them with complete contempt. And into that situation, Jesus is saying his followers would do something like turning the other cheek so that they can hit the other cheek as well. Then there's this other phrase which has entered English vocab, which shows just how important Jesus has been to the formation of our culture, to go the second mile. And so what happening here as well is at the time, Jerusalem and surrounding areas were under Roman occupation. And one of the rules of being under Roman occupation was a soldier who had heavy weights to carry, like his backpack and all that kind of stuff, could ask any civilian to carry his stuff for 1 mile. And living under Roman occupation was, that's one of the things that came with it. And obviously, Jewish people under occupation already massively resented this of being asked to do. It was like an insult as well as massively inconvenient. And Jesus is saying someone who understands the grace of God, who follows him, would do something like not just going that 1 mile, but also offering to go another mile carrying that heavy load. And then here's another example where someone is sued for their coat and offers their cloak as well. And the idea here is they're being sued for one thing, but then they offer everything. And it was actually illegal to offer the second item because this was the one thing that kept you warm. So you're literally being sued for your clothes, and you're offering to give away the one thing that will keep you warm at night. So it's like, you sued me, for $5,000, I'm going to give you my home. Like it's that kind of thing. It's going above and beyond. And what these all describe is someone who has a radically unselfish attitude towards their own rights and their possessions. Someone who holds their own rights and possessions so loosely that they're willing to suffer them in order to resist evil. And it's all summed up in the opening line of this teaching by Jesus. You have heard that it was said, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. So you know the Old Testament command that Jesus is quoting, which is eye for eye, tooth for tooth. He's saying, for the followers of Jesus, you are going to go much further than that. You are actually never going to resist an evil person. So the context of eye for eye, tooth for tooth, this was putting a limit on retribution. And Jewish culture was not the only culture that had laws like this. It's the idea of proportional justice. And we had it ourselves. The punishment should meet the crime. And if you don't have these kind of restrictions within a culture, then you end up with blood feuds, you end up with things escalating. So, if someone does X wrong, they should only be punished in proportion to the thing that they did wrong. And the idea was that everyone knew that if you did this, you got punished to the proportion that you did it wrong. That also put fear into people to not do that thing. And it says just as much in Leviticus. But the problem was and is that you can keep all the laws and completely miss the spirit of the law. And this is the problem that Jesus had with the religious experts of his days, the Pharisees, who put laws around the laws. They were so keen not to break God's laws that they added a whole bunch of other laws to it in order that they could get nowhere near to breaking the law. But what Jesus said to them, and his critique of them, and the context for this teaching is a critique of those religious experts, that you don't technically break the law, but your hearts are completely opposed to the whole point of this. To bring it into our context, if we go back to the Sarah Everard example, what people are really getting at with those protests is, it shouldn't be the case that women or men should be curfewed, which is two of the things two opposing groups were talking about, but rather it should simply be safe for a woman to walk home alone at night. We want to live in a world where these kind of laws and restrictions aren't needed. And this is what Jesus is about, is creating the kinds of people who would never do that. And if you give people boundaries and rules, all that does is stop those people from crossing over those boundaries. But Jesus instead is trying to positively create the kinds of people who are so opposed to that way of being that they would never dream of harming another person. That is ultimately what we want. A world which is good and which is safe. And Jesus' approach to teaching and to life is to create people who would never do that kind of thing. The kind of world in which those laws are no longer required. That's what he's up to. That's what grace in action is all about. The transformation of God in our own hearts. But what he's also recognizing here is that we are in a world in which some people are undergoing that transformation of their heart and other people very much aren't. And sometimes those people will clash. And within that clash, Jesus is recognizing an opportunity then rather escalate things to make the world a better place. Some people think what Jesus is teaching here is pacifism, non-violent resistance. And there are plenty of commentators and things over the years who said that is exactly what Jesus is teaching. But I would go with the majority, say that this isn't pacifism. This is non-resistance. What Jesus is teaching is for people to lay down their legitimate claims to retribution altogether, laying down their rights and their possessions completely, not resisting whatsoever. And that makes it sound incredibly passive. It makes it sound like Jesus is just asking us to be doormats, but it couldn't be further from the truth. What this is incredibly imaginative activism. This is incredibly proactive. In each of the cases, the people are not just simply lying there, but they're inviting a further action. They're using their minds, their reshaped imaginations to then ask a question of the person. And the first thing that they do, or you and I would do if we follow in this way, is we are absolutely refusing to let evil escalate. When Bonhoeffer was talking about exactly this teaching, he was a German theologian and church leader who was alive during World War II and kind of led this really radical community that was opposed to Nazism when most of the German church had actually gone along with it. He was an incredible guy, and talking about this passage, he says that evil looks for resistance in order to create more evil. But when evil is not resisted, it is extinguished and meets its match when it meets with a total lack of resistance. So this is what's going wrong in so much of the public dialogue, in things like the Sarah Everard case with that ex-Marine who was standing up to the yobs in his neighborhood, where we are trying to fight for what is good. But what actually is happening is in putting up that resistance, it just creates more evil. Evil looks for resistance to create more evil. So you say, that is wrong. The people on the other side have their egos hurt. They stand up, they get defensive, they start pushing back. That pushback causes you to push back further, causes them to push back further. And then you have this escalation. And actually, what you end up with is more evil than you started out with. But when we choose the path of non-resistance, evil is nullified, it's extinguished. I sometimes think it's kind of like the martial arts of evil, of good and evil. There's this thing in martial arts where you use the energy of the opposition against themselves. So someone comes at you with force, you turn that force into a flip to move them away from you. It's that kind of thing. All this energy comes towards you and you refuse to fight. And so, and thereby it loses all of its power. And we are refusing to let evil spread and escalate. But the other thing that you are doing, which again is far from passive, is you are changing your role from combatant to teacher. And this was something that Jesus did all the time and seems to be teaching his followers to do for other people as well. In each of these cases, by allowing the behavior to continue, and not just allowing, but actually inviting the behavior to continue, hit the other cheek, I will go the other mile. I won't just give you what you're suing me for, but much more instead. In all of those actions, you are exposing evil for what it is. And each person on the other side of that in these examples would not have thought of what they were doing as particularly evil. A soldier was taking what was his right and simply doing what everyone else did and what was owed to him. This was the way things were. It was in law. I'm not doing anything wrong. Whenever someone's suing someone else, they are always full of righteous indignation. They always think they are in the right. And it's just human nature. We never see the actions that we're doing as evil until they're shown up for what they are. And the genius of Jesus' approach is by inviting more of the same behavior, you're actually standing in the position of teacher and saying, would you like to carry that on? Is this who you are? Would you like to do more of this behavior? And this exposure of evil actually is a learning opportunity for that person. So rather than be down on the level of the person who is combating us, we get to stand aside from it, become the teacher in the situation, say, is this who you really are? Is this the kind of behavior you would like to continue? Is this the kind of world that you would like to create? Would you like to carry on this behavior? It acts like a mirror because we are always blind to our own evil and our own sin until it is shown to us when we're given the opportunity to actually carry it on. The other thing about this, though, is it is very much practical. Like Pete said earlier, as a church, one of the things we are passionate about is doing the kind of things that Jesus did. It's one of the mini revelations I had in the last couple of weeks when the penny dropped. I did a dissertation on discipleship about following Jesus with my master's degree. I was trying to talk about discipleship and stuff. And I realized one of the things I was totally blind to at the time that I've only gradually come around to over as the years have passed. And it really, the penny dropped in the last couple of weeks, is that the church in the West, the contemporary Western church, we don't really do discipleship at all. In other parts of history, when someone became a Christian, they would come under someone's tutorage for a good couple of years because learning the way of Jesus is massively counterintuitive, requires a lot of learning and a lot of practice. And so at pretty much every other point in history, you would have had a tutor or a tutorial group with you in which you would have learned the way of Jesus. But in the West, we've kind of got to this point where we've just become information consumers, where we go to the church that has the most pleasant experience, does the kind of music we like, all that kind of thing. We absorb the information, but it doesn't change anything. But Jesus' teachings were always practical. And quite often a teaching like this will get explained away because it's complicated, but he meant us to do it. And what I believe Jesus is doing here is he is creating a trigger for the trigger. So a trigger is something that creates is an outside event that creates a habitual action in you. So, if you are prone towards violence and a threat comes your way, you will act with violence. If you're prone to hiding and something terrible comes towards you, you will try and remove yourself from the situation. If you're an argumentative person and someone disagrees with you, you are habituated to start arguing back. It's a trigger for a certain behavior. And when people oppose us, when people do evil things towards us, people make our lives worse. That is a strong trigger for an automatic behavior. And for human beings, by default, that behavior is to push back in some kind of way, to create resistance. But Jesus is saying, no, 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 you are going to follow my way. And when that trigger comes, you are going to remember this teaching, and instead you're going to choose the path of non-resistance that holds up a mirror to evil and gives the other person an opportunity to change. So even though these aren't rules, they are still practical examples. They are still the kind of thing that Jesus is asking us to do. When someone tries to mooch off you at work, and someone's gossiping about you at work, when someone treats you badly in the street, when someone sues you, all of these kind of things that we encounter, well, some more common than others, when that family member is rude to you, all that kind of thing. When those trigger moments come, Jesus is creating a trigger for the trigger, a new type of behavior, so we can act in the opposite way. Now, that's not to say that this is simple. And when you start reading the commentaries on this, there's all kinds of wrestling. So if we go right back to the early church, one of the hot debates was, can someone be both a soldier and a Christian? That was one of the big questions in the first 300 years of the church. And some big theologians who we still read today said, absolutely not. You cannot be a soldier and a Christian. But one of the very first non-Jewish people to become a Christian was a centurion, a senior soldier, a person with 100 people under their command. And there seems to be no hint whatsoever in the text that that person then stopped being a soldier. And then there's also things like, when you're a parent and you have to say no to a child and you have to resist the evil that they're doing as children, does that apply there or not? It doesn't seem to work, doesn't seem to be practical. And there are all kinds of nuances and questions about how this actually works. And here's the thing, is I think that is the point. These teachings of Jesus are so radical that they're supposed to break our hearts and our heads. It's genuinely meant to be that way. It's supposed to break our hearts because God is not like us. He doesn't think in terms of getting even or getting what's owed to us. He is incredibly generous. His grace is so unlike us. He treats good and evil, with generosity, with goodness. He gives them good things. That's what Jesus says in this teaching. It's supposed to break our heart that our hearts are not like God, that we are not generous and gracious like he is. And when we see the beauty of what God is like, what Jesus is like, it's supposed to inspire us to be like him. So it's supposed, as we wrestle with a passage like this, it is supposed to break our heart. But I would genuinely believe it's also supposed to break our minds as well. It's supposed to break those preconditioned patterns of thought that cause evil to escalate in the world, for us to choose a different way. And there is no one who can tell you exactly what you should do in every situation that you will face, even this week. You are meant to wrestle with a teaching like this. I would encourage you to read it for yourself. It is at the end of Matthew chapter 5. And think about, what might this mean for you? Who are the difficult people in your lives? Who are the people who push back against you? And what is the Jesus way of dealing with that? What's the gracious way in action? What is the better way to do conflict? How can you offer non-resistance in that situation in order to bring about the greater good? How can you extinguish evil in that situation? And that will mean suffering. That will mean standing loosely both to our own egos, our rights, and our possessions. That's what Jesus did as well. Jesus couldn't do what he did for us if he wasn't willing to let it all go for our sake. And because he let it all go for our sake and didn't stand up for his rights, didn't hold on to what was his, we gained everything. We gained eternal life. And that's what the early church knew, is that this way of non-resistance, the way of grace in action, was life. One of the earliest teaching documents outside the New Testament we have is a thing called the Didache, which was a bringing together a bunch of teachings from the New Testament to make it simple for new Christians as to what it looked like to be a Christian. And what it says right at the start of the Didache was the most important thing is to love God. The second most important thing is to love your neighbor. And the way you love your neighbor, and then it goes on to quote this exact teaching about loving your enemies, turning the other cheek, praying for those who persecute you. So the early church knew it, and that is how they grew. Because this kind of activity creates a different kind of community. Every other community is defined by boundary markers of who is in and who is out, knowing who the strangers and enemies are, who are the people we are against. And that is just going through the roof right now. Almost every kind of tribe right now is defined as much by what they're against as what they're for, knowing who your enemy is, who is the wrong person on the other side of the aisle. And then Jesus comes along and says, you are to treat your enemy with love. And when you treat your enemy with love, you don't have enemies anymore. You just have a lot of friends. And that is exactly how the early church grew. It was not an insular community that only took care of its own, but it took care of people that was not like them. It took care of people who were against them. That's why something like Hope at Home so reflects the heart of Jesus. You know, people who we owe nothing to, welcoming them into our own homes to care for and love for. That is exactly the kind of implication you would take from this teaching of Jesus. No strangers, no enemies. Everyone gets treated with love. That's a radically different community, and it worked. The final bit of Jesus' teaching is that we would be perfect like our heavenly Father is perfect, that we would be as good as God is. And he says it without a hint of irony, because that is the end game of this transformation of grace as we put it in action in our own lives. Is not only does God's kingdom come on earth as in heaven, but we start to become like our God. Jesus actually says that we take on the family likeness. We become like our Father in heaven. We actually become like God. It's a process of maturity. It's not perfectionism, but it's a growing into our end product of who we are becoming. People who are as gracious as God is, who love the way that God does. And it's the only approach in this world that doesn't escalate evil, but actually makes the world a better place. So next time you're caught up in an online conflict or a real life conflict, I pray that this teaching of Jesus would be your inspiration, that evil would not escalate, but God's kingdom would come and you would be the true child of your Father in heaven.